At the end of October, a Sudanese weapons factory near Khartoum was targeted in a presumably Israeli airstrike. Israel has never confirmed or denied its involvement, yet some comments by high-positioned Israeli officials might be seen as approving the operation, stating that Sudan is a dangerous terrorist state. On the other hand, a possible preemptive strike on Iran has been making headlines for several months already. Yet, how legitimate is this kind of action? And this is something we've been discussing with our guest speakers, Professor Sergei Belayev, Associate Professor in International Law at the International Law Institute in Moscow, and Professor of International Law Achilles Skordas at the University of Bristol.
So Jan, definitely preemptive strikes are a hot issue, and all the more so that now everyone is watching the United States, trying to guess whether after the election it decides to launch a preemptive strike on Iran. And my question is just preemptive strikes. What do we actually imply by preemptive strikes? It is so easy to say that someone you dislike is actually a threat to your own security and launch a preemptive strike. But if you look at the relations between human beings, between people, that would look a little bit too aggressive.
No, certainly it would be a very aggressive situation, and much more, as you rightly say, in as how two human beings would interact if one or the other felt somewhat threatened. I think it's interesting that the question of preemptive strikes, or an intervention, if you like, into a situation, has changed very much in the recent 10 years. Before, the defining event for this really became the September 11th terrorist attacks.
Oh yes, that was a watershed.
Because before this, preemptive strikes, preemptive action by the international community was very much discussed in terms of preventing some form of humanitarian crisis, such as Kosovo, as we were talking about yesterday. After September 11th, the terrorist prospect became much more high on the agenda, and the idea of thinking about what might happen, what potential dangers are we being faced with. So rather than being faced with a real or imminent threat, people began to consider a lot more just some sort of general existential threat, some feeling of insecurity to their own safety. And I think when some of the weapons being discussed, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, having seen the reality of a terrorist attack in New York, people's judgment of what constituted imminent, what constituted plausible, I think it became very much sharpened. So I think it's no coincidence that this region in the Middle East, where so many of these incidents had taken place, is the area we're discussing now for whether preemptive strikes should be right. And certainly the country we've spoken about most, Israel, this is clearly most directly within the firing line. So a view that an Israeli might take about the imminence of a threat could be very different from someone in Europe, in the United States. So there's a very grey area, I think, in the international law, in the sense that it presents a very sort of moral, a very just picture that says, in general, aggression is to be something the international community does not approve of, but a defensive action is something that people would understand as legitimate. In principle, this sounds very fair, but in the reality of the situations, often I think it doesn't get applied so clearly, and this is why we see it being so
acute.
Yeah, so acute.
But you know, Jan, I have several remarks to make to what you've been saying just now. First of all, the experience in preemptive strikes allegedly preventing humanitarian catastrophe has not proved to be quite successful. Even if we look at the Balkans, what we see now is the humanitarian catastrophe proper, after an operation has been launched allegedly to counter the humanitarian threat. On the other hand, don't you think that the whole concept of preemptive strikes might actually be, it could actually serve as a pretext to launching an aggression against someone who allegedly presents a security threat?
Oh no, certainly there's always the threat of some manipulation, and there are some very, very high-profile cases where this manipulation has happened. In 1939, the Nazi Germany said that they had been threatened, they had been attacked in a border incident with Poland, and it was discovered...
All countries, Jan. Yes. Nazi Germany and Poland.
Yes, and in this case, it has proved the whole situation was fabricated. It was an elaborate Secret Service ruse to make it appear this way. Similarly, I think when America launched the war in Mexico, then again, this was some incident over the Rio Grande. There was some situation that said, we've been provoked, we've been threatened, when in fact it was not such a clear-cut state. So clearly I think where there's a political will, maybe that you want to launch an attack. In some instances, this precept of natural defence, of a justifiable reaction, is something that can certainly be twisted around to make it mean aggression.
Absolutely. And like you said, where there is political will, politicians start looking for pretexts. And that makes this area even more grey. But getting back to the Sudanese incident, I suggest you might now listen to our guest speaker, Professor of International Law Achilles Skordas, who's based at the University of Bristol, the UK. Yes, I suppose that the incident with Sudan would be just a parting point for our interview. But since everyone seems to be pointing at Israel, and this has not been proved yet, but in general, some people are saying that a country, a government, is authorized to make some kind of preemptive strikes if it feels that a terrorist threat is coming from another sovereign country.
Well, international law is on some points clear, on some other points less clear. The International Court of Justice has always interpreted the right of self-defense in a restrictive way, both in its advisory opinion on the construction of the wall in 2004 and in the case Congo versus Uganda of 2005. It clearly indicated that the exercise of the right of self-defense against a threat and against something coming from the outside presupposes first an armed attack, and secondly, this armed attack must be attributable to a state. Therefore, international law does not recognize the right of self-defense against non-state actors as such. And international law also does not recognize the preemptive self-defense as it was enunciated by the United States in 2002. Therefore, if this incident, the bombing of the weapons factory in Khartoum, is attributable to Israel, then Israel has the burden of proof that the government of Sudan was planning an ongoing attack against Israel, and I don't think that the facts would establish this claim.
Well, there's been a strike, and there are some witnesses with giving evidence of. So what should the international community, or perhaps what should the Sudanese government do to establish law?
International law is indeed weak in that point. The government of Sudan can bring the issue before the United Nations Security Council, for instance. In theory, the Security Council could decide a fact-finding mission, which I don't find it realistic under the current circumstances. So I have the feeling that the incident will not be sufficiently clarified through international procedures. What the case may be is that perhaps Israel could admit the strike, could justify it, could bring forward information justifying what happened, or perhaps a group of experts may further try to find information based on evidence on the site of the attack. These are some of the possibilities that are open to the government of Sudan and to the international community as well.
This is Burning Point.
Just to remind you, we're talking to Achilles Skordas, the Professor of International Law at the University of Bristol.
So, if I get you right, everything seems to be resting simply on the goodwill of the key actors.
Yes, I'm afraid that there is nothing more that can be done at the present stage. And here I would like also to make a distinction between what happened a few days ago in Sudan and the policy of targeted killings, which is a policy that the United States follows with regard to Al-Qaeda operatives. Now, targeted killings are somehow different because when these policies are implemented, they sometimes have the consent of the states on whose territories the attacks are perpetrated, for instance, Yemen or Somalia. Or sometimes they have the implicit or the explicit approval of the UN Security Council, as it was in the case with the killing of bin Laden. So we should differentiate these policies which are conducted in the course of the fight against terrorism, against Al-Qaeda, and acts which are conducted against third states like Sudan that may or may not provide assistance to groups like Hamas. If the reporting is true that Israel indeed has conducted this attack, there is no consent by Sudan, and there is no right to a preemptive strike connected with potential activities of the Hamas. So the burden of proof is on a high threshold here for Israel.
As far as I understand, there's been several instances in which Israel seems to have committed similar attacks on the territory of Sudan. And it always preferred not to comment on the issue. It has always abstained from any comments, just like in this case. But on the other hand, you mentioned a similar, a preemptive attack which was carried out by the United States. And as far as I understand, there's been several. So does that mean that the international legislation needs to be revised somehow? Or is there any way to ensure that the legislation is being followed by international players?
Yeah, here we should recognize the important role of the United Nations Security Council. In fact, the war against Al-Qaeda terrorism has been recognized as a main objective of the international community, and it has been reiterated by many resolutions of the Security Council. Therefore, the Security Council seems to implicitly acquiesce, to implicitly approve the policy of targeted killings against Al-Qaeda terrorists as a strategy in the war against Al-Qaeda. The Security Council has not approved any similar policies against Hamas or Hezbollah. And the difference is not so much in international law as in the policies of the Security Council, which we should keep in mind, has the authority to adopt binding resolutions for the international community. Therefore, it's the Security Council itself which regulates these questions and approves some forms of use of force and disapproves others. But to come back to the question of self-defense, if indeed is an exercise of the right of self-defense, Article 51 of the Charter requires the state that invokes the right to inform the Security Council, give the reasons, so that the international community knows about these facts. And indeed, if Israel or any other country has information of terrorist plannings or of a terrorist infrastructure in Iraq, in Sudan, it should indeed inform the Security Council so that the members would know what the situation is.
Professor, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker was Achilles Skordas, Professor of International Law at the University of Bristol.
This is the Voice of Russia.
This is Burning Point, trying to understand whether preemptive strikes are legitimate according to international legislation. Well, since the professor said that the whole area is so opaque and unclear, we could try to look at it in fuller detail, and therefore we addressed our next guest speaker, Professor Sergei Belayev, inviting him to talk about that in more depth.
International law has a kind of distinguishing between preemptive strike and preventive strikes in terms of preventive military operation, which are called very often as preventive wars. First of all, preemptive strikes are strikes which are immediate before a threat. At the same time, if we speak about preventive strikes are foreseeing a danger or risk or threat of a war which is more far. From this point of view, it is not a case of immediate threats which is provoking a preemptive strikes. It's a kind of definitions which are used in international law, in Western or in Russian doctrines, and it is recognized like a difference. At the same time, to proceed with analysis of just preemptive strike or preventive strikes, we should see that, first of all, United Nations Charter prohibited use of force and threats of use. From this point of view, generally speaking, preventive wars are prohibited as any type of other wars by the United Charter. At the same time, we have few exceptions for the use of force. First of all, it's a use of coercive measures by the Security Council of the United Nations. It's a first just war under contemporary conditions. Secondly, we have two articles of the United Charter, Article 52 and 53, which allows to international regional organization to use international military operation in terms of military use of force, foreseeing that the Security Council is not yet taking any decision. In terms, if Security Council is considering these circumstances and situation, regional organization should submit its decisions to the decisions of the Security Council. And there is another exception from the general prohibition of use of force and threats of force. It's a right of self-defense, rights to self-defense, which is foreseen by the Articles 51. These rights give the possibility to interpret the use of force as a possibility for the case if there is a kind of aggression against the state. Under such circumstances, some international lawyers develop theory of justification of preemptive or preventive strikes. But at the same time, we should see that right to self-defense, it's a kind of very narrow notion, which is interpreted normally as an aggression. If there is no aggression, there is no right to self-defense. United Nations Charter and commentaries to the United Nations Charter don't speak about the general possibility to right to self-defense because it is only possible for the case of aggressive war. From this point of view, there are no other legal possibilities for preemptive or preventive strikes excepting three articles of the United Nations Charter. First of all, coercive measures by the Security Council of the United Nations itself. In other cases, preemptive strikes or preventive strikes, it is a notion which is submitted to very strict limitations and may be used only by the countries which see immediate threat, first of all, and secondly, which use proportional force for this possibility to act in terms of imminent military aggression. It's my point of view, but at the same time I try to describe general theory of international law on preventive measures which could be taken by actor of international law.
So it is still not quite clear whether international legislation authorizes preemptive strikes or not. What is your impression? Because I'm not a lawyer and I find it a little bit difficult to work out through all those intricacies.
My feeling is that this lack of clarity really relies upon, there's several different moral precepts, if you like, that are being applied to this. There's one precept that's trying to say war is wrong, there's so much human suffering, there's so much bad that results from this, that we should not allow carte blanche for countries to declare war. This has been a long aim. In the Middle Ages, people tried to discuss the idea of a just war, if it was ever possible to go to war. The League of Nations in the early 20th century tried to prohibit war. So there's been a very, very strong impetus within the legislation to minimise, to prevent, to have as little war as possible. And this is very clearly seen in the fact that there are many prohibitions on what constitutes a legal war. However, equally so, there's a very strong principle of the nation-state. The nation-state is the building block. It holds communities together. It holds nations together. And it's seen as something...
At least it used to be so in the 20th century.
It was certainly as a strong concept for unifying countries and strengthening an international order. So there's a principle that says these blocks must be able to defend themselves. And it's a very sort of natural human reaction, a national reaction, to feel that when you are being threatened, then there should be some right to resist that.
The question is just how far can you go in defending yourself before you have been attacked?
Yeah, exactly.
So getting back to Professor Belayev again.
From theoretical point of view, some international lawyer affirms that, for example, Israel used preemptive strikes against nuclear reactor in Iraq 81. The same country used preemptive strikes against Syria to 2007 without any precisions about the immediate threat or nuclear threat from these countries. Some countries use bilateral decisions or coalition decisions to use preemptive strikes, or at the same time pretend that they have the right to wage preventive wars. Leading countries of the United Nations, some members of the Security Council, member states are pretending that they have the right to wage preemptive strikes. Whether it is legitimate or not, it is a very serious question which should be considered under each concrete situation. I believe that a definition of aggression which is developed by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is giving some grounds to find more solid legal grounds for definition of aggression, as well as for this element for using force in terms of preemptive or preventive strikes. Moreover, I would say that not only definition which is given by the United Nations and the International Criminal Court is necessary to have some legal backgrounds for definition of preventive military operation.
But Jan, I thought you said that the 9/11 was a kind of a watershed in the understanding of aggression and preemptive strikes.
Well, I think it certainly had a very strong impact on people, certainly because it made this threat of a terrorist attack much more real, much more imminent to people. So certainly one of the causes for aggression is fear. And if people can have that greater sense of fear, then they are much more likely to feel that aggression or hostile response is necessary.
The resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations after 9/11 developed a more broad definition of aggression, including large-scale acts of terrorism, which is giving ground from coercive measures of the Security Council and preventive measures by the members of the international community. And it is understandable that these resolutions were giving some grounds for military intervention of the United Nations and coalition in Iraq and Afghanistan. From this point of view, legitimization of the Security Council of the United Nations is necessary to use such strikes.
So, as far as I understand, the so-called spontaneous preemptive action without the sanction of the United Nations Security Council is still seen as illegal, according to international law.
Yes, there's that definite case, as the professor explained, that in this instance it's generally regarded as illegal, and there's certainly a diplomatic process, a legal process that needs to be gone through to assess the legality of this kind of action.
Generally speaking, international law does not provide solid legal backgrounds for preventive strikes on bilateral level or on coalition level. Every situation should be analyzed carefully on the ground of existing legal normative documents, first of all. Secondly, it is necessary to see that the most legitimate use of preemptive measures or coercive measures, it is done by the most representative body of international community, which is United Nations, and first of all, Security Council of the United Nations. That's my point of view.
Professor, thank you so much. And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Professor Sergei Belayev, Associate Professor in International Law at the International Law Institute in Moscow. Well, and with this we end this edition of Burning Point, brought to you by the Voice of Russia radio station. It was presented by me, Ekaterina Kudashkina.
And me, Ian Sumter.
Thank you so much for staying with us.